It was an ordinary afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the small outdoor cafe where Steven Seagal sat quietly at a corner table. Dressed simply in a dark shirt and sunglasses, he looked like any other man enjoying a peaceful moment. A cup of tea rested untouched in front of him as he observed the world around him with calm, steady eyes. People were laughing. Cars passed slowly. Nothing seemed unusual. Until suddenly, everything changed. Out of nowhere, a little girl, no older than 8, came running down the sidewalk. Her face was red from crying, her small hands trembling. She looked around desperately, as if searching for someone, anyone, who would listen. And then she saw him. She ran straight toward Steven, tears streaming down her face. Without hesitation, she grabbed his arm tightly. "Please," she sobbed. "They're beating my mama." The words cut through the noise of the street like a sharp blade. For a brief second, everything felt frozen. People nearby turned their heads. Some stood up halfway from their chairs. A few reached for their phones. But no one moved forward. This moment reveals something powerful about human nature. Psychologists call it the bystander effect. When many people witness a crisis, responsibility spreads thin. Everyone assumes someone else will step in. And so, often no one does. Steven slowly removed his sunglasses. His expression didn't show panic, it showed focus. Controlled intensity. He looked down at the trembling child, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. "Where?" he asked softly. She pointed toward a narrow alley across the street, where distant shouting could now be heard. A woman's voice. Angry male voices. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Whispers spread. Should someone call the police? Is this real? Someone should do something. But still, no one moved. Steven stood up slowly, his chair scraping lightly against the pavement. The air felt heavier now. Tense. He gently placed a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "Stay behind me," he said calmly. And then he began walking toward the sound of chaos. If you were sitting there that afternoon, would you have stepped in? Or would you have waited for someone else to act? Because what happened next, no one there would ever forget. Steven Seagal didn't rush. He didn't sprint toward the alley in a burst of emotion. Instead, he moved with steady, deliberate steps, the kind of walk that signaled control rather than chaos. Behind him, the little girl followed for a second before he gently turned and knelt again. "Stay here," he said calmly, pointing toward a bench near the cafe. "You'll be safe right here. I promise." She nodded, though her small hands were still shaking. The shouting grew louder as Steven approached the narrow alleyway between two brick buildings. The peaceful afternoon atmosphere had completely shifted. What had once been the sound of clinking cups and casual conversation was now replaced by tension, sharp voices, anger, fear. As he turned the corner into the alley, the scene became clear. Two grown men were aggressively confronting a woman. One had her arm tightly gripped. The other stood in front of her, shouting just inches from her face. She looked terrified, trying to shield herself, trying to pull away. "Please stop," she cried. A few people stood at a distance, watching. Some had already pulled out their phones. Recording. Whispering. But not stepping in. This is another difficult truth about human psychology. Fear spreads quickly in groups. When a situation feels unpredictable, most people choose self-preservation. They tell themselves, "It's not my problem." Or worse, "It's too dangerous." Steven stepped forward into the alley. "That's enough," he said calmly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Both men turned. One of them scoffed. "Who are you supposed to be?" Steven didn't answer that question. Instead, he looked directly at the man gripping the woman's arm. "Let her go." The words were simple, clear, controlled. The man laughed harshly. "Mind your business, old man. This doesn't concern you." Steven's expression didn't change. "It concerns me now." There was something unsettling about how calm he remained. No shouting. No threats. Just presence. The second man stepped closer, puffing his chest out in a show of dominance. "You don't want to get involved." Around them, more bystanders had gathered at the entrance of the alley. Phones were raised. Some whispered, "Is that? No way. It looks like Steven Seagal." But Steven wasn't performing for a crowd. He wasn't posturing. He took one more step forward, positioning himself slightly between the men and the woman. "Walk away," he said evenly. "Right now." The air felt electric. This is the moment where most confrontations tip in one direction or another. When ego meets resistance, people often escalate, not because they have to, but because they feel challenged. Pride can be more dangerous than anger. One of the men shoved Steven hard in the chest. Gasps echoed from the alley entrance. The woman stumbled backward, finally breaking free from the grip. Steven barely moved from the shove. He looked down briefly at the man's hand, then back up into his eyes. Still calm. Still steady. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Before we go any further, tell me in the comments. Which country and city are you watching from? And be honest, in your city, would people step in to stop something like this? Or would they just record it? Because what happened in the next few seconds completely changed the energy of that alley forever. The shove echoed louder than it should have. For a split second, the alley went silent. Steven Seagal did not stumble. He did not flare up in anger. He simply absorbed the force, his feet grounded, his posture steady like a rooted tree refusing to bend in a storm. The man who pushed him smirked, mistaking calm for weakness. "You should have stayed at your little cafe," he sneered. Steven's eyes remained fixed on him, not with rage, but with something far more unsettling, control. "Walk away," Steven repeated. "No one else needs to get hurt." But ego is a powerful trigger. When someone feels challenged in front of an audience, pride often overrides logic. The second man, sensing the growing crowd at the alley entrance, stepped forward aggressively. "Oh, you think you're some kind of hero?" And without warning, he threw a punch. It happened fast. Gasps erupted from the bystanders. The little girl, watching from the edge of the alley, covered her mouth in fear. But what happened next was even faster. Steven moved with fluid precision. He didn't swing wildly. He didn't lash out. Instead, he redirected the punch, guiding the attacker's momentum past him. With a swift, controlled motion, he turned the man's wrist and shifted his balance. In less than a second, the attacker found himself on the ground, not brutally slammed, not injured, just immobilized and shocked. The crowd froze. The man who had shoved Steven stared in disbelief. "You." Before he could finish his sentence, he lunged forward recklessly. Again, Steven responded rather than reacted. He stepped aside, using minimal force, allowing the man's own aggression to work against him. A simple pivot. A controlled grip. A calculated shift of weight. The second attacker lost balance and stumbled hard against the brick wall. No dramatic punches. No uncontrolled violence. Just efficiency. The woman quickly moved away, breathing heavily, her back against the wall as tears streamed down her face. The energy in the alley had completely shifted. What started as intimidation had turned into hesitation. This moment reveals something powerful about discipline. Most people equate strength with dominance, loudness, aggression, intimidation. But true strength often looks quiet, measured, intentional. Steven didn't look angry. He looked focused. He stepped back slightly, giving both men space to make a decision. "It's over," he said calmly. "Leave." For a brief second, it seemed like they might. But humiliation is a dangerous emotion. Being embarrassed in front of a crowd can push someone to make even worse choices. One of the men scrambled to his feet, face flushed with anger. "You think this makes you tough?" he shouted. Steven didn't respond to the insult. He didn't need to. Instead, he positioned himself clearly between the attackers and the woman, a silent barrier. Behind him, the little girl's quiet sobbing could still be heard. And that sound changed everything. You could see it in Steven's expression, not rage, but resolve. Because at its core, this wasn't about proving something. It was about protection. The man charged again, this time more desperate than confident. Steven intercepted him smoothly, redirecting his forward motion downward. The attacker ended up pinned briefly, unable to move, his own momentum working against him. "Enough," Steven said quietly. The second man, now breathing hard, looked around and noticed something new. Phones. Dozens of them. Recording everything. Whispers filled the air. "Did you see that? He barely touched them. This guy is trained." The power dynamic had fully reversed. The attackers were no longer the dominant force in the alley. They were exposed. And exposure changes behavior. Steven released the restrained man and stepped back again, giving them a clear path to leave. "I won't say it again," he said calmly. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in their eyes. Because they now understood something important. He wasn't fighting from anger. He was operating from discipline. Pause for a second and think, what makes someone truly strong? Is it physical power? Or the ability to control yourself under pressure? Comment below, power or control, which one defines real strength in your opinion? The woman slowly made her way toward her daughter. They embraced tightly, both shaking. Steven remained standing between them and the two men, watchful but composed. In the distance, faint sirens could finally be heard approaching. The attackers exchanged nervous glances. What started as an easy target had turned into a public spectacle. And now, they were no longer in control. But the biggest shock of all hadn't even happened yet. The faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. In the narrow alley, the energy had completely transformed. Just moments ago, the two men had stood tall, aggressive, certain of their dominance. Now, they stood uncertain, breathing heavily, glancing at the growing crowd at the entrance of the alley. Steven Seagal remained exactly where he was. Still. Grounded. Unshaken. He wasn't chasing them. He wasn't threatening them. He was simply standing between danger and the people who needed protection. And sometimes, that is the most powerful position a person can take. The woman held her daughter tightly now, whispering reassurance through trembling breaths. The little girl clung to her mother's jacket, eyes wide, occasionally glancing at Steven as if trying to understand what had just happened. Around them, the bystanders had grown bolder. They were no longer hiding behind uncertainty. They were recording openly now. Some even stepped a little closer. Whispers traveled quickly through the small crowd. "Did you see how fast that was? He barely moved. Is that really who I think it is?" One man leaned toward his friend and said quietly, "That looks like Steven Seagal." The name moved through the crowd like a ripple in water. But Steven showed no sign of reacting to it. No change in posture. No hint of pride. If he heard the whispers, he ignored them. Because this was never about recognition. The two attackers shifted uncomfortably. One wiped sweat from his forehead, trying to regain composure. "You're going to regret this," he muttered, though the confidence in his voice had clearly faded. Steven looked at him steadily. "No," he replied calmly. "You are." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The sirens were closer now. The flashing lights reflected faintly against the brick walls at the alley's entrance. For the first time, the attackers seemed to fully grasp the situation. They were no longer intimidating a defenseless woman in a hidden corner. They were standing in front of witnesses. Cameras. Consequences. This moment highlights something important about human behavior. Aggression thrives in isolation. It grows stronger when no one challenges it. But the moment light is shined on it, when witnesses step forward, it begins to shrink. One of the men took a cautious step backward. "This was just a misunderstanding," he said quickly, trying to reshape the narrative. But the woman's shaken voice broke through the tension. "No, it wasn't." Her words carried weight. Because now, she wasn't alone. Steven turned slightly toward her, his voice softening. "You're safe," he said again. And those two words seemed to settle something deep inside her. The attackers exchanged another glance. Their earlier arrogance had completely dissolved. Now, they looked cornered, not physically trapped, but socially exposed. One of them pointed at Steven. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Steven paused before answering. "I think everyone deserves to feel safe." That response hung in the air longer than any punch could have. True strength doesn't need dramatic lines. It speaks plainly. The crowd had grown even larger now. People from the cafe had gathered at the alley entrance. Some nodded in approval. Others shook their heads at the attackers. The power balance had fully reversed. Earlier, the attackers controlled the scene through fear. Now, Steven controlled it through calm authority. And that difference matters. Fear demands attention. Calm commands respect. The flashing lights of the approaching police cars finally filled the alley entrance completely. Tires screeched lightly as the vehicles came to a stop. The attackers stiffened. One whispered urgently to the other, "Say he attacked us first." But several people in the crowd immediately responded. "We recorded everything. We saw what happened." Phones were raised higher. This is how narratives change, not just through action, but through witnesses willing to speak. Steven stepped back slightly as the officers approached, creating space. He did not look victorious. He did not look proud. He simply looked composed. The woman wiped her tears and stood straighter, holding her daughter's hand tightly. For the little girl, this moment would likely be remembered forever. The day fear turned into safety. And as the police officers stepped out of their vehicles, scanning the scene, one of them looked directly at Steven with a curious expression, as if something about him seemed familiar. But that recognition had not yet been spoken aloud. Do you think courage spreads? When one person stands up, does it give others the strength to do the same? Because what happened next didn't just change the outcome of this situation. It changed how everyone in that alley saw strength itself. The flashing red and blue lights painted the alley walls in sharp bursts of color as two police officers stepped out of their vehicles. The once chaotic scene had shifted into a tense silence, the kind that comes when everyone knows the next few minutes will decide everything. Steven Seagal stepped slightly to the side, creating clear space between himself and the two men. His hands were visible. Open. Calm. The attackers immediately tried to regain control of the narrative. "He attacked us," one of them blurted out, pointing aggressively. "We were just defending ourselves." The second man nodded quickly. "Yeah. He came out of nowhere." It was a predictable move. When people realize they are losing power, they often try to rewrite the story. Not because it's true, but because confusion can buy time. One of the officers raised a hand. "Everybody calm down." The woman, still shaking but holding her daughter close, spoke up. "That's not true," she said firmly. "They were hurting me." Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. Around them, multiple bystanders stepped forward. "We recorded everything," a man from the cafe said. "They were attacking her first. He told them to walk away." Several phones were raised toward the officers. This is something important about truth. When multiple perspectives align, false narratives begin to collapse. The officer looked from the attackers to Steven. "Sir," he said carefully, "can you tell me what happened?" Steven's tone remained steady. "I was sitting across the street. A little girl asked for help. I came here. I told them to leave. They chose not to. No dramatic storytelling. No exaggeration. Just facts." The attackers scoffed, but their confidence was clearly fading. One of the officers turned to review the footage being offered by witnesses. Within seconds, the video confirmed what everyone had seen: the aggression, the shove, the attempted punches. The atmosphere shifted again. Now it wasn't just public opinion. It was evidence. The first attacker's posture changed noticeably. His shoulders dropped slightly. His eyes avoided direct contact. The officer's voice grew firmer. "Turn around." Handcuffs clicked into place. In that moment, power fully transferred. But here's the deeper lesson. Power gained through intimidation is fragile. Power grounded in integrity is stable. Steven had never tried to overpower the situation. He simply held his ground long enough for truth to surface. The little girl peeked from behind her mother, watching the men who had caused so much fear now being led away. One of them muttered angrily, "This isn't over." Steven didn't respond. Because when someone says that in defeat, it's usually a reflection of wounded pride, not actual strength. The second officer approached Steven again, studying his face more closely now. "You handled that professionally," the officer said carefully. Have you had training? There was a brief pause. Yes, Steven replied simply. He didn't elaborate. He didn't list achievements. He didn't mention decades of martial arts mastery. He didn't need to. This moment reveals something powerful about identity. Many people rush to use their status when under pressure, to drop names, to assert importance. But true confidence doesn't require announcement. The officer nodded slowly. Well, we appreciate you stepping in. Behind them, the crowd began to murmur again, but this time, the tone was different. Respectful. Not because of fame, but because of composure. The woman finally found her voice more clearly. Thank you, she said to Steven, her eyes filled with gratitude. If you hadn't... Her sentence trailed off. Sometimes gratitude is too big for words. Steven gave a small nod. No one deserves that, he said. Simple. Direct. Human. And in that simplicity lies something profound. Courage is often romanticized as dramatic and explosive. But in reality, it is usually quiet. Controlled. Grounded in principle. The officer finished securing the attackers and guided them toward the patrol car. As they passed through the crowd, the same people who had earlier stood frozen were now openly condemning their actions. This is how social accountability works. When someone breaks the silence, others follow. The alley no longer felt threatening. It felt lighter. Safer. But there was still one more shift about to happen, one that would change the emotional tone of the entire scene. The officer returned from the patrol car and looked again at Steven, squinting slightly as recognition slowly formed. Wait a second. The crowd grew quieter. Something was about to click. Do you think people are judged differently once their identity or status is revealed? If the officer had recognized him earlier, would the situation have unfolded differently? Because in the next few moments, the dynamic would change once again, not because of force, but because of recognition. The tension in the alley was palpable. The two attackers had been secured, their initial aggression replaced with visible unease. They shuffled nervously toward the patrol cars, occasionally glancing over their shoulders. For the first time that afternoon, the crowd felt a collective sense of relief, but the story wasn't over yet. Steven Seagal remained between the woman and the now subdued attackers, his posture calm and composed. The little girl clung to her mother, eyes wide, still trembling, but there was a glimmer of hope in her gaze as she looked up at him. It was then that one of the officers stepped closer to Steven, squinting as if trying to place a familiar face. Wait, aren't you Steven Seagal? The officer asked quietly, disbelief lacing his tone. The words spread through the crowd like wildfire. Gasps and murmurs grew louder. People craned their necks, whispering to one another. Steven Seagal, the martial arts legend? No way, that's him. The actor. The guy from all the action movies. Recognition had a strange effect. What had been a tense and frightening scenario now carried a new weight. The attackers' body language shifted. Their bravado crumbled as they realized they hadn't been confronting just any man. They had been standing against someone with decades of training, someone capable of precision, someone the world knew for facing danger head-on. Yet Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't boast. He didn't flex his fame. He remained grounded, his eyes calm, scanning the scene to ensure the woman and her daughter were safe. This is a subtle but profound human truth. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs to be present. The little girl's eyes widened even more, recognition dawning. You're the man from the movies, she whispered, awe and relief mingling in her tone. Steven knelt down slowly to meet her gaze at eye level. He smiled gently, but there was gravity in his expression. You're safe now, he said, his voice soft but firm. Always speak up when something is wrong. Her mother stepped forward, still shaken but beginning to regain composure. She placed her hand on Steven's shoulder, gratitude written across her face. I don't know how to thank you, she said, voice trembling. If you hadn't come... Steven shook his head slightly. You don't need to thank me. Everyone deserves protection. Everyone deserves to feel safe. This moment brought an important lesson into sharp focus. Heroism isn't about glory. It's about action. It's about standing up for others when no one else will, and doing so with integrity. The attackers, meanwhile, were being loaded into the patrol car, their faces a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and disbelief. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Not only had they been defeated physically and socially, but their actions had been recorded and witnessed by dozens of people. There would be accountability. There would be consequences. Psychologists often note that witnessing a moral act has a profound effect on observers. The crowd, initially frozen by the bystander effect, had shifted. They had witnessed courage, calm, and discipline in action. They now had a model to reflect on, intervention, measured yet decisive, rooted in principle rather than emotion. Many in the crowd began to cheer softly, others clapped. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. Some whispered stories of past incidents when they wished someone had stepped in. Steven stood, allowing the little girl and her mother to approach him. The child ran into his arms, hugging him tightly. The embrace was short but full of meaning, the kind that imprints on memory for life. "Thank you," the girl whispered between sobs. Steven's hand rested gently on her back. "Remember," he said, "being brave doesn't mean never feeling fear. It means acting despite it." The woman nodded in agreement, holding her daughter closer. The crowd had fallen silent, listening. Even the officers seemed momentarily reflective. Now came another quiet but powerful human moment. Someone in the crowd stepped forward, phone in hand, and asked Steven for a photo. He shook his head lightly. "This isn't about fame," he said quietly. "It's about respect, and standing up when it's needed." This is another important lesson. Humility amplifies strength. The ability to protect without arrogance, to act without expecting recognition, is the truest form of courage. As the police prepared to lead the attackers away, Steven stayed a few steps behind the woman and her daughter, making sure they were truly safe before moving. For the little girl, this would be a moment remembered forever. The day a stranger, a man of incredible skill and calm, stepped in when she was terrified and alone. For the crowd, it was a lesson in human behavior. Courage, presence, and integrity could change the course of events in an instant. For the attackers, it was a lesson in consequences, accountability, and the limits of aggression. And for Steven Seagal, it was simply another reminder of why he trained, why he acted, and why standing up for others, no matter who sees, matters more than anything else. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever witnessed someone in danger and stepped in? Or did fear hold you back? What would you have done if you were the little girl, looking up at Steven Seagal? Share your story in the comments. Hero if someone has protected you, brave if you've ever stood up for someone else. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments are the ones we can learn from, and the ones that inspire others to act. The flashing police lights dimmed, and the last of the attackers were taken away. The woman and her daughter clung to each other, still shaken, still breathing heavily, but now safe. The alley that had moments ago been filled with tension and fear was now quiet, except for the low hum of cameras, phones, and whispers of astonishment. Steven Seagal stood a few feet away, observing the scene with his calm, measured presence. He didn't look for praise. He didn't bask in attention. His focus remained on the safety of the woman and her child. Even as the crowd began murmuring in recognition of who he was, he treated it as secondary, unimportant. Yet, the world was about to take notice. Several people in the crowd had been recording the entire incident. Phones tilted, cameras capturing every subtle movement, the controlled maneuvers, the calm warnings, the unwavering stance between danger and vulnerability. Within hours, the clips were being uploaded online. Short clips, split into 30-second highlights, began circulating on social media platforms. People were stunned. Comments poured in by the thousands. Real-life hero. Wow, that was incredible. Who is that guy? That was insane control. He didn't even yell. He just stopped them with calmness. The video began to go viral. By the end of the day, millions had seen the clips. The hashtags #Steven Seagal Hero, #RealLifeAction, and #ProtectTheInnocent began trending. News outlets shared the story, reporting on the man who stepped in when no one else would. The woman, still holding her daughter, was interviewed for local news. Her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly. "He didn't even have to fight them, but he protected us. I don't know how to thank him enough. He saved my family." But Steven wasn't there for recognition. He never sought it. He didn't appear in front of the cameras, nor did he give interviews. Instead, he made one quiet statement to a reporter who approached him. Strength is not about domination. It's about protection. True power is measured by how you act when no one is watching, and by how you treat those who cannot defend themselves. This quiet philosophy resonated with millions around the world. The story was not about fame, not about celebrity status. It was about moral courage, discipline, and the timeless lesson that action speaks louder than words. Psychologists studying social behavior pointed to the ripple effect of such acts. When one person steps in to protect someone in need, it reduces the bystander effect for everyone watching. In other words, Steven's actions didn't just save a woman and her daughter. They inspired countless others to recognize their own capacity to act courageously. Even the attacker's story became a cautionary tale. Social media posts dissected their actions, highlighting how aggression and intimidation fail when faced with discipline, presence, and accountability. Some commentators noted the irony. Their bravado had been neutralized not by violence, but by calm, precise intervention. Meanwhile, the little girl and her mother received support from the community. Neighbors, inspired by what they had seen, offered help and reassurance. A sense of solidarity spread through the local area, showing that one act of courage could ignite a wave of collective awareness and responsibility. In interviews days later, people around the world reflected on what they had witnessed online. Many admitted that they had been paralyzed in similar situations, unsure whether to intervene. Watching someone like Steven act decisively, yet humanely, gave them a model of bravery that was accessible to everyone. Not because he was a celebrity, but because he demonstrated the core principles of courage, empathy, and control. Steven himself returned to a quiet routine. He didn't seek accolades or public attention. But the lesson lingered. People around the globe were sharing stories of standing up for others, of speaking out when injustice occurred, inspired by the viral footage. Schools used it as an example of moral courage. Martial arts dojos referenced his restraint and discipline. Communities discussed the importance of stepping in, safely, when someone is in danger. The woman and her daughter eventually returned to their daily lives, but they carried the memory of that afternoon as a turning point. The little girl, once terrified and helpless, now had a model of courage to emulate: calm, decisive, protective, and humane. And in the digital world, the video continued to circulate. Millions of people had already seen it. Millions more would. The story became more than a viral clip. It became a movement in microcosm. The reminder that strength is not measured in dominance or fame, but in action, restraint, and protection of the vulnerable. Think about it. How would you act in a situation like this? Would you step in to protect someone, even if it meant putting yourself at risk? Type respect in the comments if you believe everyone deserves protection. Share your story of courage or intervention. Let's show the world that morality, bravery, and human empathy are stronger than fear. Because this wasn't just a story about one man stopping two attackers. It was a lesson in humanity, in doing what's right, in standing up for the helpless, and inspiring millions to believe they, too, can make a difference. In the end, that alleyway was no longer just a place of fear. It became a symbol, a reminder that even a single, calm, courageous individual can change the course of events, impact countless lives, and leave a mark that echoes far beyond the moment itself.